If the next generation were to look at our lives years from now and see how we contended for the faith, would they be able to tell we were contenders, or would our contending be marked by inconsistency? Let's look at that subject today on this episode of the Contend Podcast. Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of the Contend Podcast. We're going to continue in our Contenders Through History series, and today we're looking at someone who is definitely one of my favorite characters in the Bible, someone who's very well known. There's a lot about his life in the Bible. We're looking at the subject of Joseph, or the person, I should say, the character of Joseph. We get a good look at his life in several chapters of Genesis. About Genesis 37 really starts talking about the main part of his life, and then on through the end of the book of Genesis, we can see different things that happened in his life and how he reacted to them. And really the main point, as you know from these lessons, we have one main point. I'm going to give that to you at the beginning instead of the end like we have in the past couple weeks. But we see Joseph was a contender for the faith consistently. He was consistent in his walk with God and in the way that he handled himself even through adversity. We see when he was a younger man, he dreamed dreams about the future, and although he had no idea necessarily what they meant, he didn't understand, but he knew that God was trying to show him something, and God was doing something in his life, and even causing his brothers to hate him and despise him, really, and even his father kind of reprimanded him for his second dream. But the Bible does point us to the fact that his father did kind of think about what he had dreamed, and we see how his consistency caused him really to be hated, because he was someone who was in tune with God. He was listening to God's voice, and so we see him hated because of it. And then when he goes to check on his brothers, they say, "Oh, here comes this dreamer," and they even conspire to kill him, but his brother kept him from doing that. But they did throw him into a pit, and ended up selling him to the Ishmaelites and the Midianites, and sold into slavery into Egypt. And we see him once again, his consistency for his contending caused his brothers to despise him, as I said. But then we see his consistency continuing in the house of Potiphar. He's a very wise man, and we see over and over that the Lord caused him to prosper. He was a very prosperous man, that the Lord was with him. And Potiphar noticed this. He saw that he was prosperous, and he put everything that he had under the rule of Joseph, who was in essence a slave, but still Potiphar trusted him very much in that manner. But we see obviously the situation with Potiphar's wife tempting Joseph, and because of that we see him thrown into prison. Another instance of his consistency and his fortitude as a contender, causing someone to turn against him. But we see him in prison, and his consistency evident once again in prison when the leader, or the head of the prison, the head guard, puts him in charge of the prisoners. And that's something that we don't see much or hear much of today, a prisoner who's in charge of the prisoners. But we see how he was someone who was consistent even there. The Lord showed him the interpretation of the butler and the baker's dreams, and how one was going to be killed, one was going to be restored. And even when we see him being forgotten by the man who was restored, when he left, he said, "Hey, remember who I am, remember me," and he ends up forgetting about him. But even during that time in his life, we see him consistent. He never turned his back on God, just as Job. We can see the same thing there. No matter what happened in his life, he didn't sin, he didn't charge God foolishly, and he was someone who was consistent even there. And that leads him to the position that we find him in second in command in Egypt. We see him there next to Pharaoh planning, and we see that even Pharaoh noticed that the Spirit of God was with him. And Pharaoh, obviously someone who wasn't a Christian, not a believer, not someone who would be looking for the Spirit of God, but even he could see that Joseph had the Spirit of God on him, and I think that's very evident to very pointing to the fact that he was consistent. He wasn't someone who was one day a contender and the next day wasn't, and wishy-washy. He was someone who was a contender every day and very consistent in his walk with God, and consistent in the way that he handled himself in those situations. And Pharaoh saw that. He saw that the Spirit of God was with him, and we know how the rest of Joseph's life played out, with his brothers coming to Egypt for food, and then his father ends up there years later. And what a testimony that is of the consistency that we should have as contenders. So I want to encourage you today, as you contend for the faith, to contend consistently. Don't be hot one day and cold the next. Don't be wishy-washy in your contending, but be very consistent as you contend for the faith. Stay tuned for some thought-provoking and yet convicting stats about church outreach on today's Contend Wrap-Up. Today on the Contend Wrap-Up, we're going to look at 4 stats regarding inviting people to church. At least 82% of people polled say they're somewhat likely to attend church if invited. That's 4 in 5 people. On the converse, only 2% of church members extend a personal invitation in a given year. That means 98% of church members don't ever invite someone within a year. 7 of 10 people say they have never been invited to church. 70% have never been invited. 67% of Americans say a personal invitation from a friend, family member, or neighbor would be somewhat to very effective in getting them to attend church. 67% of Americans, if we were to invite them, they say they would come. Something very important to think about as we contend for the faith, to invite people to church. Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed this video and episode of the Contend Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Let me know what you think about the video in the comments. Maybe check out some of our other videos and check out some of our other resources, and get your Contend merch at samgeckler.com. And remember, don't be a pretender, be a contender.